Hello and welcome to Bedhead Books. Tonight we are going to be talking about Life After Dark by Dave Haslam. This is a history of British nightclubs and music venues. Haslam was born in Manchester and got his start in the industry as a DJ, working around numerous Manchester venues with significant figures such as Mike Pickering. Prior to this book, he has written a couple of books about the city of Manchester and the scene itself, but he also wrote a book in 2010 about DJ culture, so we're in very safe hands here. We start off with a little bit of backstory from the late 19th century, the music halls and the ballrooms that were springing up in the UK, the rise of live entertainment, and because of the success of these venues and the entrepreneurs who ran them, this actually led to the first ever chains in the UK. So before we had Wetherspoons, before we had more recent nightclub chains such as Pop World and Reflex, we had the Mecca ballrooms and Locarno ballrooms in various locations across the UK. Music at that time would have probably only played a small kind of part as something that was used to augment bawdy, outrageous comedy routines, at least bawdy for the time. Of course, at the turn of the century, things did start to change, and these venues faced some very fierce competition from cinema. So first of all, silent pictures and then later talking pictures, radio, and finally television. And so now, the performers who had spent so long in the music halls and the variety theatres had to adapt their style to one, if not all, of these mediums. And there were notable successes, but many of them did fail, because a very curious thing about variety theatres in the UK is that acts would go from venue to venue, sometimes playing at the same venue on a succession of nights, and they would perform the same 5 to 10 minutes of material because this material wasn't preserved anywhere, so it was still fresh. But once it had been on radio and television, several comedians and no doubt musicians had to start working with co-writers and sometimes hiring writers to take care of their repertoire completely because they didn't have enough material to tour with. Although they did not play as significant a role as they later would do, the women in the UK played a big role in both pre-war and post-war Britain. So during both World Wars, they would often be working at the munitions factory, doing jobs that men would normally be doing were it not for the fact they were doing their national service. And this obviously greatly liberated women, and it meant they were more inclined to go out to venues and nightclubs and to express themselves more openly. Sometimes they would go without their partner and without any kind of chaperone, and because of that we are where we've been since then, really. And of course, because the boyfriends and the husbands were away in far off countries, when they came back they brought records with them. First blues, then jazz, and then rock and roll, and that is kind of how the homegrown musical revolution started in the UK. And smaller venues now started springing up in basements and coffee shops where jazz bands would perform. Now, in a previous episode I mentioned the Musicians' Union. We'll talk about them a bit more here as we are more specifically focused on the UK. So in the 40s and 50s, the Musicians' Union had a ban on American musicians. They wanted to use homegrown talent wherever possible, and this meant that many of the jazz and later rock and roll acts couldn't come over to the UK, and we had to develop our own version of it. And while our approximation and interpretation of American music isn't always great, it usually throws up something interesting. And we got band leaders such as Bilk and Humphrey Lyttleton, and we also got a generation of teenagers who were encouraged to adopt another underappreciated form of music from America known as skiffle. Now, our skiffle was lower budget. The only real instrument that we could stretch to was the acoustic guitar. We would use a washboard for percussion. We would have a tea chest and a broom with a string on it for a bass. And it's because of both skiffle and jazz that we got the Beatles, because they began life as a skiffle group, the Quarrymen, and their training ground was the Cavern in Liverpool, which started off as a jazz venue. Which brings me nicely on to the significant venues that Haslam acknowledges in the book, such as the Cavern, later Eric's in Liverpool, which is depicted on the back cover here, if you can see that, Mother's in Birmingham, the Twisted Wheel in Manchester, which is where the Northern Soul scene gained its momentum, the Marquee in London, so many other venues that played a key role in nurturing not just the band culture but later the DJ culture. And once again, this incurred the wrath of the Musicians' Union, and the slogan that we now see absolutely everywhere, and we have done for many, many years, which is "Keep Music Live," that was spawned by the competition between musicians and DJs, and musicians having the feeling that DJs were taking their jobs and their income. One of the most interesting things about so many of the venues in this book, as recently as the mid-90s, is the fact that many of them did not operate with an alcohol license. This was due to licensing laws in the UK. If you had an alcohol license, you had to operate at, I believe the specific times were 9 AM till 2 PM, then you had to close, and then you could open up again at 4 PM, I want to say 4 PM, and go through till 9 or perhaps 10 or 11 in the evening if you were lucky. Some of the venues did get around this by serving food, which allowed them to apply for an alcohol license, but many of them did not, and this is how the drug culture arose in a number of these venues. We've got the mods popping their pills in the 60s, and we've got ecstasy arriving in Britain in the 1980s. This obviously did have a negative effect because it led to the closure of several venues, the most notable being Manchester's Hacienda. So in the 1970s, as more money started to pour in and the venues started to get bigger and louder, they started to operate on a more elite exclusive kind of policy, and a lot of venues would model themselves on Studio 54 in New York. You had to dress right, you had to adhere to the dress code of the venue, not a hair out of place. And of course, this kick-started the punk rock revolution in retaliation. People making their own music, their own clothes, putting on their own gigs. And while there's so many successful bands, including the Sex Pistols and the Clash and the Slits, there are just as many bands that may not have been as popular and may not have had audiences as big, but the audiences that they did have often comprised people who went on to a career in the creative industry in some form. But this relationship between music and fashion arguably reached its peak with the New Romantic movement in the 1980s. Several scenes where bands such as Duran Duran and Spandau Ballet would refuse to play in particular venues because it did not fit with the image that they wanted to pursue and portray, and they weren't going to risk dying on their arse. Fortunately, they were able to find a lot of like-minded people, and a significant venue around that time was a venue in London called Billy's. I want to talk about this one in particular because one night they had a very special guest, that guest being David Bowie. He just finished recording his Scary Monsters and Super Creeps album, and he wanted to record a video for Ashes to Ashes, and he needed extras, and he found them in Billy's nightclub. And that really splashed the new romantic aesthetic all over UK TV screens. Life After Dark, I feel, will resonate with a lot of people because it's a very important part of our life, our clubbing, our socialising years. You know, it's where we decide what music we like, what clothes we want to wear, what drinks we want to drink, how good we are at talking to the opposite sex, although obviously that's a minefield all of its own. And reading this book, wherever you're from in the UK, I think you'll get a swell of pride for the venues that have passed through your town or city and the contribution that they've made to the industry. For example, when I read about the various Sheffield venues, including Jive Turkey, and the role that Jive Turkey played not only in recruiting Suzanne and Joanne into the Human League, but also in pushing Acid House and Acid House's success in the UK. When several clubs in the south of England didn't get it, several clubs like Jive Turkey in the north did, and that makes me very proud. So Life After Dark has a lot of nice things going for it, and I am going to give it a 7 out of 10. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, don't judge this book by its cover.
Night.